Ali, and you're listening to part 2 of our collaboration episode with Swampside Chats, discussing Stafford Beers' Designing Freedom. If you haven't caught part 1 yet, I'd recommend pausing this episode, going back 1 and starting from there. Otherwise, enjoy the show.
Where there is a revelation of market truth that happens in the sort of high bourgeois period, and then everything after that is deviation.
Yeah, and like by contrast then, like you've got Beer here, who says the workers of a society can in fact design a society that will run itself along cybernetic principles, but that doesn't have to be a kind of like emerging from the noise of the market. That it is possible to do better than random chance if you apply some basic principles of organizational science.
Right. And, like, Nick Land in particular, who claims, like, to be a cybernetician.
He is the worst fucking read on cybernetics. I fucking hate how ignorant he is of that shit. And he uses the goddamn word to justify his bullshit all the fucking time. And I want to fucking punch him.
Yeah. Basically, he takes that sort of, like, logic that, like, runs through that sort of complexity argument that runs through Hayek, and turns it into this sort of like vaguely theological notion called cosmic anarchy.
Yeah.
He refers to it as cosmic anarchy, and basically everything in the universe is becoming including societies as a whole are becoming complex and increasingly atomized to the point where it just it just like cuts itself all bits and pieces just like completely separate. And it's become more and more of a metaphysical concept as it's gone along. Like, there's a recent article that he did in Jacko by, I forget the title of the article itself, but basically he tries to argue that, you know, it's something inherited in the universe itself that, like, basically race science and frickin', what's it called? And frickin'
what, like IQ bullshit?
No. It's like physics, theoretical physics, modern theoretical. Modern theoretical. Quantum mechanics basically justifies this sort of cosmic anarchy view that all of extreme atomization of all subjects within. The death of subjectivity. And
so when a philosopher reaches for quantum mechanics, you reach for your Kalashnikov.
So is he gonna be a character in like Cyberpunk 2077?
He's gonna be DLC. He's gonna be game breaking DLC.
So, like, the thing here is that, like, I mean, even if some of that analysis is some of it. I mean, look, I'm not going to fucking say I agree with Nick, right? But like, some of it is kind of true at its limit, right? That, like, again, the world is at its limit ultimately unknowable. It tends towards proliferating variety, and it will eventually peter out in a kind of entropic heat death. However, even if that's true, like, navigation is still possible, right? Like, it is to go back to the kind of navigational metaphor from which cybernetics is kind of the word comes from, like that. The steersman in the boat on the ocean, like, the ocean is crazy fucking complex. You're never going to understand the position and velocity of every molecule of water. You're never really going to understand the kind of the entirety of the weather system. And yet navigation is still possible. Like, it is still tractable in practice by doing this kind of constant feedback loop of evaluate, adjust, right? Like, that steering action allows for that kind of tractability even in the face of something that tends towards chaos. So, like, for me, it's a lot like, people tend to have this thing where, they believe that such a quantity is at 100%, such as like human agency. We start out with the belief that human agency is at 100% and like we're totally masters of our own destiny. And then they find out that that's not the case. And then they go completely nihilist and like, we must have 0% agency, right? Like throw it all out, right? This kind of shit. And it's like, no, don't throw it all the fuck out, right? Like there's a lot of numbers between 0 and 100, right? Like, that you, even in the face of not having total control, control, you can still have, in practice, good enough control. So it kind of ties in with some of the stuff we covered in People's Republic of Walmart, right? That like you have these kind of like planning systems being deployed right now, which are not perfect, but they are more than good enough, you know, like for Walmart and Amazon, right? Like, you don't have to calculate the entirety of the economy in order to do good enough adaptation. You can just kind of run a couple of calculations in an Excel spreadsheet and round it to 2 decimal places, and you'll get more or less the right kind of result. So yeah, fuck Land. Jesus, that fucking guy. Oh my god.
Yeah, we constantly dunk on Land and General Intellect Unit.
He still hasn't taken me up on that offer of a boxing match that I challenged him to.
That sounds too satisfying. Charity. What charity would he donate it to? Like HBD research?
No, just kick his ass. So yeah, I think that's all the sort of important stuff, right? To kind of really nail down there is that like this can be a great antidote for getting us away from like perfect solutions. Like cybernetics in general can get us away from obsessing over like having to get every tiny little thing perfect before doing anything. Cybernetics emphasizes smart adaptation and feedback and learning as its kind of core sort of building blocks for building better organizations.
I mean, that is like a potentially hopeful metaphor because, you know, if like human beings can like, you know, navigate the like Pacific Oceans on, you know, like these like rinky-dink boats,
yeah,
you know, to colonize Polynesia, like maybe we can somehow like get through like the climate apocalypse that we're basically creating. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But like to get there requires what Beers' advice is at the end is just basically to destroy most of the institutions we know because they're beyond the point of saving. They are so unadaptive that they've become crystallized and rigid, and they have to be smashed, and other institutions have to be built in their place.
And I think what is interesting for me about that idea is that Beer's sort of language and the metaphors he employs would suggest that rigidity would also cause them to be very fragile. And so there must be properties of these systems that have developed such rigidity that would allow them to be overcome, right? Like it can be exploited because if you're rigid, then in a viability sense, that you're not doing very well. So I don't know. I've been trying to read like sort of cybernetic strategic theory lately. It is scary the extent to which like the sort of post-Vietnam War developments in U.S. military strategic theory line up with a lot of this stuff. You know, critiquing a lot of the same sorts of things that Beer was critiquing at this time.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, maybe on the left we need to have sort of a arm's length consideration of that. There's a lot of it where I think it could be useful. There's also a lot of it that is inherently rooted in sort of the way a state thinks that may need to be overcome.
I mean, maybe they have, but it certainly hasn't done dick for our military. You know, like they still can't win a war.
Yeah. It's like the IDF talking about like fucking Deleuze and that sort of thing, like reading 1,000 Plateaus, the IDF reading it. Like they just used it to figure out, hey, it would be cool to just blow up walls and just come on in.
Yeah. No, it's very much that vein of sort of thinking, for sure.
I don't know. I guess American-style cybernetics aren't all there is, or Israeli-style. And I'd be interested in some of this, like, cybernetic strategic theory because, like, the left desperately needs to answer some questions of organization, but not in the way that the Third International tried to answer these questions, kind of apart from society. Like, that wasn't their self-conception. Isn't what they intended to do, but... You know, that's just sort of the historical situation they found themselves in.
Not to go all New Age, but I feel like it comes, like, the difference between American cybernetics and, like, British cybernetics comes out of a consideration of, like, more Eastern modes of thought. I don't want to be like Orientalist in the dumb, like spacey New Age way, but it definitely comes out of a consideration of like sort of Taoism, and that sort of thing. And like Stafford Beers, like more explicitly draws upon Taoism and like Eastern modes of thought later in his career more explicitly, although it's always there. You just can't really admit it when he's like working with like big managerial types and businesses and that sort of thing.
Yeah, totally. Like, I mean, when he's writing Brain of the Firm and that sort of stuff, it's all very straight-laced kind of managerial stuff. And then later on, he goes kind of like after this point, right after Chile, after Designing Freedom, he really opens up. And I mean, like his book that comes after these, Platform for Change, really opens up with like, I'm basically in the opening lines, he's like, I'm tired of hiding what I really think and who I am, you know. And now it's gloves off, basically.
Yeah. Come out, babe. Come out.
Nowadays, he would foreground that stuff on purpose, though.
Yeah.
It's all about, like, repackaging, like, exotic Eastern ideas, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, definitely. Like, yeah, so, you know, he was really heavily influenced by his time in India with the British Army, I think it was. You know, he was there sort of on military business, but he took the opportunity to kind of, like, immerse himself in all of the local spiritual practices, and that was all just very like closeted for him until after the Chilean Revolution, and then it started to come out more as like a part of like a sort of a background element of his thinking that had not been obvious and not been stated, but then he kind of made it obvious later in his life. And you're absolutely right that like it's very in vogue to kind of take these kinds of like Eastern philosophical systems, that kind of stuff, and like bring it into organizational theory now. I guess he was just ahead of his time, but like hopefully we can salvage something out of it that isn't just like, you know, the kind of typical like toxic deployment of like enlightenment and self-care discourse to justify like personal responsibility and ignoring oppression.
I mean, yeah, you do say that, Jake, but think of how philosophy courses in the United States and like Eastern and like Europe in general just generally don't touch upon like Taoism and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm about to start teaching Intro to Philosophy, and like I'm gonna have a lot of caveats about what is discussed in the course, because it's like this is a really narrow view of human thought, but you know, this is what it is.
It's incredibly narrow.
Even the people who pick up like the flag of, you know, decolonizing thought and decolonization generally just go back to like European philosophers like Heidegger and Foucault to like rationalize their own like decolonial thought, their frameworks for decolonization, philosophical decolonization praxis, whatever the hell you want to call what they're doing.
Well, you know, the truth is that it's really a lot of work to be acquainted with a whole different tradition, and a lot of the philosophical traditions that are outside of the sort of Western framework, you know, they have an entirely different canon that you need to get familiar with. And, you know, that's like a lot of work. It takes a lot of engagement to really chew on a canon. And that's why people stay so cloistered within their, like you know, like, I don't know, Western, you know, like Western and Western philosophy and the philosophy that was sort of continued on in the Islamic world. It's a pretty big enterprise. It spans like a long time, and it spans a lot of places. And so for a lot of people, that's close enough to world philosophy where they don't care, and they just wash their hands of getting acquainted with traditions outside of it. And sometimes they don't even get acquainted with the part of the tradition that is developed in the Islamic world, even though it's perfectly continuous.
And a lot of these traditions are sometimes are not even really carried through writing per se, but are just carried through like, you know, oral traditions and that sort of thing. Like in rural China and that sort of, where literacy is relatively low.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's another layer of what makes, you know, a truly integrated world philosophy very difficult, because the whole concept of what we know as philosophy to a large degree is based on written texts and texts that are able to be, transmitted semi-reliably through time. And there's extensive debates in Africana philosophy and like indigenous philosophy about how to regard, oral text.
It's absolutely both true that like the philosophical tradition remains quite Eurocentric. It's trying to sort of do outreach stuff, but very much on its own terms. And also, it's very much the case that like management theory is very omnivorous and open and just like, okay, like we'll just take whatever, like these are two sort of like what are they called, like sort of royal sciences that have different approaches, right?
Hypothetically, a project like cybernetics could maybe, like, this is some speculative dumb stuff, but like hypothetically cybernetics could overcome like the boundaries between like Eastern and Western like bodies of thought, and like even like the distinction between science and like philosophy, that's the initial goal of like cybernetics, not the overcoming of difference between Western modes of thought and generally Eastern modes of thought, although they shouldn't really be collectively like ratified in that way. But it's more of like a unifying science of like sciences. Like that's the initial project of cybernetics, to find laws for working through all the sciences.
Yeah. But this is exactly what Engels wanted to do
right.
in Dialectics of Nature and in Anti-Düring. And there's something about Hegel's dialectical system that is explicitly like non-law abiding. And Hegel wrote stuff basically saying like, you're never going to be able to express what I'm saying about dialectics in a set of formal laws, because what I'm talking about are the gaps in forms. Mm-hmm. That, when you re-carve up the world with different concepts, there's always an excluded middle. And as you like move on from different ways of carving up the world being relevant, these things, like the way that those things like pass into each other. Whereas like, cybernetics like gives us the opportunity to do some kind of generalization that approaches, finding the laws of analysis.
Yeah.
Right? That dialectical materialism traditionally was trying to attain. But it's very important that we acknowledge, what some people in critical theory do acknowledge, and that actually like the frogs, like the French Marxists in the 50s, like Sartre and Althusser, both articulate this, that, like what Marxist dialectics would be, it will be qualitatively different than Hegelian dialectics. And, mm-hmm. and that whole early Marxist tradition about philosophy of science is painfully like trying to shoehorn and try to do what Marx did, but not like doesn't have the same finesse. Like, mm-hmm. whereas I feel like cybernetics like kind of squares the circle in a way, and is just a genuine like theoretical advance. And basically, you don't really have to engage with like, Hegel to understand systems theory.
I think the commonality I can see between Hegelian dialectics and cybernetics is that these are both sort of perspectives on the world that are oriented towards lack, that towards limitation, and I think that has a lot of sort of common results that come out of them, although they have quite different methods. They have a sort of universalizing orientation. They have that at the same time, they also have an orientation towards like limitation.
Also with Hegel, there's like an emphasis on holism, just general whole organisms and basically like sort of proto systems theory sort of stuff within Hegel itself. And it's interesting because when I first started really getting into philosophy, I read Bertrand Russell's just general history of Western philosophy, which is big mistake, but big mistake overall. But it was interesting because now that I look back on it, his little chapter on Hegel, where he basically dismisses Hegel as being a mysticist that's influenced by mysticism, kind of actually makes more sense, and probably what made him a more lasting philosopher, more worthwhile philosopher than Bertrand Russell in the end. It's just he wasn't limited by a certain kind of hyper Cartesian mode of Western thought that Bertrand Russell is, and generally the earlier developments of analytical philosophy are just tied up in.
But even it's funny because yes, Bertrand Russell is basically chained to his period. His big project, the Principia Mathematica, it tanks, and he's kind of just known the way Sartre is as a cultural figure in philosophy. Whereas you look at the collaborator on, or you look at his co-author on the Principia, Alfred North Whitehead, who goes on to do totally awesome bong rip process ontology in the analytic tradition. And so you're right about Bertrand Russell, and you're right about a whole slew of this of analytical philosophers. But there's pretty sweet liminal spaces within that tradition that are generative.
I mean, what my sort of experience was with engaging with the logical positivists later in my sort of intellectual development, I had that kind of initial introduction to Russell, and then I went to university, and I had a lot of teachers coming out of the continental tradition who just dismissed the whole thing as narrow-minded. And whenever I looked over at the analytic philosophers I knew, that certainly seemed to track. And when I kind of went back to the history and I saw where logical positivism came from and sort of the context they were working within, it made a lot more sense to me where it was coming from, and how it I could give it a much more charitable reading, in the sense that you had this split in neo-Kantianism that happens prior to this, and these were people living in Vienna at a time of fascist ascendancy. The university was controlled by the fascists for the most part. Germany was going fascist, Italy had already gone fascist, and you have people like Heidegger who are kind of working out of that sort of Hegelian side of things. Not just Heidegger, there were figures within Austria itself who are using that.
If you say Heidegger is the Hegelian, I think Heidegger stands will get mad at you, but go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
he's a German national figure.
It would be more accurate to say that Heidegger was influenced by the Marburg School, which was influenced by neo-Kantianism, which was influenced by Hegel. There's a kind of breakdown of neo-Kantianism into different extreme sides around this time. But what I'm trying to say is that the logical positivists were trying to make a philosophical rejoinder to the sort of discourse that was happening around them at that time, which was using that kind of mysticism in order to justify fascism. And right. So when you understand that actual context, as opposed to just what logical positivism went on to be in a very sterile Cold War American environment, I have a lot more sympathy for what they were trying to do.
Oh, yeah. No, because that's why they wanted to eliminate metaphysics. Metaphysics, Julius. Metaphysics, the whole Marxist tradition talking about metaphysics and trying to just get rid of that entirely. Nobody took that more seriously than the logical positivists. I don't know. In the history of philosophy, it's hard to not look at them as chaotic, kind of figures. Kind of tragic, but also sort of dignified in their attempt.
Yeah, like, say what you will about dialectics of nature, you can have... There's people like Gould who, like, actually applied it in a way that wasn't dogmatic. And there's general insights that you can get from dialectical materialism that's probably drawn out by Mao. Well, I know people are going to give me shit for saying Mao drew out, like, aspects of dialectical...
How dare you?
Yeah.
He didn't really understand it. That's cool.
I feel like there's something in contradiction that's actually worthwhile, but that's like specifically drawn from Taoist dialectics in relation. But anyways, yeah, there is just like you can say there was something relatively useful drawn from it, where logical positivism is just a solid dead end in thought.
It basically proved that you can't It was a great foil for people like Gödel, who made a genuine advance in thought. Whereas, like, you can't prove the kinds of things you guys are trying to prove.
Mm-hmm.
It basically provokes a sympathetic figure into doing that. And G.A. Cohen has a sort of defensive logical positivism where he just thinks that Anglophone thought is better for having passed through its influence, which I think a lot of people disagree with, but. Considering the kind of ways that people think that dominate the world and build, very, very useful models that help them dominate markets and dominate our lives, I actually take that quite seriously.
I mean, to a certain extent, but I feel like that's also a byproduct of its relationship to the military, just the attempt by the social sciences to graft themselves onto the military-industrial complex during the 50s with the United States. Basically the whole of academia is disciplined towards getting research for the military.
And still kind of is. And still basically kind of is. It's mostly oriented towards big state industries, kind of like that, like defense contractors, or, just the state itself.
So, I mean, the first thing is I just want to correct myself. Heidegger was influenced by the Southwest School, not the Marburg School.
Breaking my balls, saying.
For those listening, you don't have to at me. Also, I have a lot. I'm quite a big fan of Neurath. And
I was just thinking about him.
Yeah, and I really have a lot of appreciation for his work on unity of science, which was tied to logical positivism, and that kind of idea of there's so much that falls out of that in terms of a kind of nuanced understanding of reality, a orientation towards internationalism, a view of philosophy as something that is not exclusively limited to professional academics. All of that stuff I think is extremely good, and it was all kind of quashed by the Cold War. I talk to people in philosophy of science these days, and they're like, oh yeah, there's this new movement. I'm like, oh yeah, Neurath already thought about that decades ago. It's just he died too early, and he was silenced by the war. Well,
the thing is that is the manifesto of the logical positivists was towards a scientific worldview. And Neurath is giving basically the definitive statement of this. And I think if you're a Marxist and you're thinking about the scientific worldview, the resonance is a bit obvious, right? Mm-hmm. What Michael Heinrich would call worldview Marxism, and the kind of set of principles that Engels sets out in Anti-Düring. However you quibble with the phrasing of the principle or this or that interpretation of dialectics, it's not hard to see the resemblance to scientific socialism in this scientific worldview that Neurath is defending.
And to sort of just bring this back to the discussion of cybernetics, I think there's a lot in Neurath that is compatible with a cybernetic orientation, especially as Beer formulates it. Because, we tend to think about, I guess there's a kind of naive understanding of Neurath that he was just this very, irascible debater and, had a kind of, absolutist positions about philosophy because of his hostility to metaphysics. But like when you actually get into like the sort of breadth of his thinking, you can see, oh yeah, like there's actually a lot of overlap here. Like there's a lot of really cool stuff. You know, what ended up happening with logical positivism is, of course, really regrettable. So yeah.
Have you guys read Nassim Taleb? Am I saying that? Yeah.
I don't know.
Nassim Taleb?
I think we've established on this
Is this the Black Swan?
Continually.
Taleb,
Yeah, the Black Swan guy.
Black Star. Sorry.
Yeah, I cannot pronounce names at all.
Mostaf and Nassim Taleb, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, like it's actually kind of similar to a lot of. He actually has anti-fragility as a concept is generally similar to like cosmic anarchy and Nick Land, only it's probably more rational because it's not a weird metaphysical thing going on, or at least it's
sounds
not
like viability.
Yeah, basically anti-fragility. It's like a rationalization that he uses to justify, like, just sort of like his like neo-Schumpeter sort of like view of capitalism that's like centered around like sort of entrepreneurs, introducing black swans or whatever, these sort of like new innovations that change everything, and the whole of human history is basically guided by like great individuals or these events that come out of nowhere. And essentially, yeah, that's something that comes out of like complexity. His position generally comes out of complexity sciences that are like, a sort of later development on cybernetics, although cybernetics is not. There's a lot of lost in between the transition from like cybernetics to modern complexity sciences.
Yeah, and that's a history I've kind of been exposed to by reading Mirowski, like Machine Dreams. But I don't have a super great grasp of like what is the specific process by which you get from cybernetics to complexity theory. It's a little bit fuzzy in my head still, so it's something I'd like to know more about.
Yeah, I think it's just because like it takes like insights that are in cybernetics that end up like not really being all that credible, I guess, like for some reason in academic circles, because cybernetics just generally gets pushed to the side out of academia. Yes. And that sort of thing, and it's just like solely in the military industrial complex, or like just people like Beer just like working in like business. Right. Or it ends up being like weird associated with science fiction, and generally that just leaves people in academia not really to look into it deeper, I guess.
Yeah, you can only take that kind of Jameson type ironic stance towards it, right?
Right.
So we want to go around with concluding thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. This is really, really accessible. It's like, it's really fun to think of this on the equivalent of PBS or the BBC or whatever. And
it's the CBC, so split the difference.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's one divided by the other, basically.
So sure it hurts.
Yeah, sick burn Canada.
Yeah, as the Canadian in the room, I know way too much about the history of the CBC because I came out of a Canadian communications program, and like it is not a happy history.
Oh no.
I actually grew up pretty close to Canada, so I used to watch CBC, like the television.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Like, this was my main source for Simpsons reruns.
Awesome.
So, oh yeah. Well, anyway, so this is a great, like, popularization effort, and you can tell by listening to the lectures that he threw everyone for a loop, and, like, towards the end, I don't know, it says that there will be a rebuttal, and, you know, like there was some controversy over him having revised a draft or something. It made it sound like that in airing his views, he caused quite a stir.
What? He just called for the collapse of all modern institutions.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of what I was going to read. So basically, I think that there's, you know, something great here. It is sort of a bitter pill that if this resonates with us, we have to swallow, the way that this sort of like, yeah, we're anti-institutional thought was used in Generation X as a kind of ideology. And so we have to be aware to the degree that this is like some, you know, bong rip bullshit backflip cognitive map to like justify a certain kind of institutional defense, which sounds dumb. How could you read this and do that? But, you know, welcome to the 90s and 80s. Like, so, I don't know. Like, I think that this communicates to me more like why, like, when I've approached technical disciplines, the kind of intellectual culture is so much more optimistic and enterprising and intuitive and, frankly, skilled than the Marxist intellectual, like, worlds that I've come across. Like, they just have, like, a better orientation towards basically the same shit that Marxists want to be oriented towards, for the most part. Like, understanding institutions and viability and yada yada. Like, all the things that you would take seriously if you gave a shit about, you know, I don't know, like, reconceptualizing what socialism would be or something. Like, from a utopian or a scientific standpoint, like, at all. Like, like...
I think so revisiting this text has been interesting. I think where I'm at with it, I have a sort of few points that I'm kind of pondering. I think the first one is that you see a lot of this emphasis on autonomy in beer, and, you know, when you think about that from a broad social perspective, like, I can see how that would be very positive, but I really have a hard time reconciling that with something like Reconstruction. It troubles me a lot, and, like, I see kind of like, you know, we've had a lot of people in our Slack sort of mention the example of Rojava, and it's kind of like, well, you know, I'm no expert on that. It does seem like there's some interesting stuff being there that kind of rhymes with what Beer is saying. You know, that is, I can't make any kind of strong pronouncements, but that's just a point that it weighs on my mind. It's like, yeah, but what about Reconstruction? Right?
Well,
like
that ties in to exactly like how CyberSyn failed, right? Like the preconditions for its existence was a class struggle against the bourgeoisie, and its failure was a result of the failure of that class struggle, right? And so, like, basically, for Reconstruction to have been successful, you know, Lincoln and the people in political power in Washington would have had to conduct a conscious class war against the remnants of the old slave-owning regime, which they didn't do, right? So, you know, like, the preconditions for some kind of, autonomy and self-management would be basically the destruction of the class system.
Well, they did have a conscious class struggle at a certain point that, like, the slaveholding class kicking and screaming dragged Lincoln to an understanding of class consciousness. Lincoln kept trying to prioritize the national interest, but eventually he became convinced, and you can see this in his writings, that there really wasn't a reconcilable class difference and that the slaveholders would have to be expropriated without compensation. And he, like, for even just a few months before the end of the war, he was kicking and screaming against understanding things in a conflictual sense. It sort of he just didn't like thinking of things as conflict. He wanted everyone to get along. But at the end of the day...
Did he seriously consider land reform, though? Like, was that on the agenda for Lincoln?
So, like, Lincoln was killed very soon after the end of the Civil War, and his vice president that came in was much more racist. Like Lincoln was a white supremacist and only started to think seriously about black suffrage towards the end of his life. For the beginning of his abolitionist career, he followed someone named Henry Clay, who after abolition wanted to deport all the slaves and recolonize them in Africa. So like
Lincoln's background was coming out of the Whig Party, you know. He's
right.
just sort of the moderates of his time period, and like generally the idea of like freeing the slaves to free them on their own, you know, was not a particularly popular idea even within the Republican Party. The Republican Party generally before the Civil War was more focused on limiting the spread of slavery. There was definitely like abolitionists within the party, but it was more focused on limiting the spread of slavery into
that's why the war started.
West. And yeah, even during the war, like Lincoln and the party was apprehensive about making it about slavery until it became strategically important as a way of like getting crippling like the Southern economy by getting slaves to run away.
Yeah, also just enlisting former slaves as troops. Like they were just, as a matter of policy, turning down, you know, runaway slaves that wanted to join, you know, people that were going to fight like their freedom depended on it, that had an intimate knowledge of the enemy. And they kept turning them away and hurting the overall morale of their own effort by recognizing a form of property that they were really, you know, fundamentally, they had to fight against in order to win the war.
But to get back to the original point, maybe, you'd basically, there needs to be like a class war as a precondition for, you know, this kind of...
Right. And I guess it's kind of like... My thought is not so much like, do we need the class war? Because, I mean, yeah, of course. But it's like, what does autonomy look like in that context? Right? Like, is there a way in which Reconstruction could have been oriented in such a way that there could have been some degree of autonomy in areas in the South but still carried on the class war, and that would have been effective? Like, I mean, I just think about those kinds of situations where it's like you get into this titanic social struggle, and like, where does autonomy fit into organization in those contexts? Because I think that's important to revolutionary strategy.
Yeah. CLR James looks at takes like a sort of like black autonomous perspective, which also like Harry Cleaver. Mm-hmm. But you know, autonomy for whom? In Reconstruction, part of it is enfranchising the black population and asserting black autonomy. And you know, that's part of the design of freedom, would be to tweak for these things. I think that would be true, you know, with regards to sex and gender, with regards to every oppression under the sun.
And I guess the other point that I really have been sort of thinking about a lot here is this this definition of viability. So there's a section in this lecture series where Beer talks about the sort of dysfunctions of current bureaucracy and the way that it becomes sort of cancerous and continues to perpetuate itself, right? And then the term he uses there is what is it, Shane? It's hyperstable, ultra stability. Yeah, ultra stability. Yeah, because when you kind of look at the definition of ultra stability, it seems to be more or less the definition of viability in slightly different words. And I think what Beer is really trying to get at here is that viable systems, in the sense that Beer means them, are viable in the long run. It kind of gets to that idea about like sustainability a little bit. And there's also that aspect of freedom. And I think that Beer's argument here is that having that autonomy and cohesion, having that freedom that it produces, will lead to viability in the long run, even if we could say that, say, the Pentagon today is a viable system in the short run, right? Like it is, like, without question, ultra stable, right? Like it does a lot to preserve its existence in this world. It is effective in a certain way in doing that, right? Like whether that's about getting funding, whether that's about destroying enemies of America, whether that's about having certain propaganda efforts within the American society, it does do all of those things, but it certainly does not match the VSM that Beer is describing. And so I think there's just a little bit more thinking we need to do to kind of clarify what we're talking about.
I think this is actually a great example of how the short format of this really kind of hurts it, in that a lot of the concerns there are actually kind of addressed in the early chapters of Heart of the Enterprise, which was published after this, I think. It came afterwards. But where Beer talks about the whole notion that the purpose of a system is what it does, but then he talks about how do you define the purposes of a system. And for him, purpose is like an inherently subjective thing, that the observer is involved in the interpretation of a system, and that, like, for these kind of social systems, like, what purpose they actually serve is going to be a socio-political kind of judgment, right? Like, for one person, the Pentagon is a machine that produces a paycheck. For another person, the Pentagon is a machine that produces death and destruction. For another person, it's a machine that produces freedom or whatever. That this is like because viability is measured in terms of, like, how good is this thing at its purpose. Evaluating viability has to pass by way of, like, a socio-political process of evaluating what do we even want out of these systems. And then the bureaucracies, these kind of, like, cancerous bureaucracies, are really systems which have become ultra stable, but at a purpose which is self-defined for themselves, like a kind of like an Ouroboros, right? Like it's just a sort of a self-generating thing, rather than it being something whose purpose is kind of accountable to any kind of to a society. So unfortunately, he can't cram that in here. Right? Like there's nowhere near enough time. But then this is kind of a bit of a problem, right? That, like, to really get Beer, you're looking at a couple of 1,000 pages of fucking study, like, and it's, oh boy, it's a hell of a project,
Yeah, and I do think there's a certain way in which that kind of critique, like, kind of loops back to, like, Hegel's philosophy of right, and his understanding of the state and, like, the sort of cohesion of society and all that kind of thing. And then, we can kind of look at Marx's critique of that, right? So I think there's a lot of, like, productive directions we can go with this. It's just there's a little bit of fuzziness here that I would like to see further refined. I think there's even potentially fuzziness in Beer's thinking that we probably need to investigate further. I think this is kind of my closing remarks, is that, like, I think I'm largely with Kyle on this, that, like, I think this is very promising stuff, and I think this is, like, kind of hand in glove with Marxism. Like, I think we can claim cybernetics as a socialist technology, but I would also caution against kind of thinking of it as a kind of silver bullet solution. I think you need a kind of Beerian Marxism or whatever, or a Marxist Beerianism, where each informs the other, because, like, to design freedom in this way, you need the class struggle, and for the class struggle to succeed, you need a design for organizations. It's a yin yang scenario. Like, I don't think you can lean on any one of these pillars and hope to succeed. And I would really caution against simply kind of leaning on Beerian cybernetics as your only pillar, right? Right, absolutely.
Jake?
I am interested in his thoughts and wish to subscribe to his newsletter.
You can subscribe to fucking General Intellect Unit.
Yeah. Emancipation Network.
Yeah. Oh, goddamn.
If you, like, get enough patrons, will you visit the Beer estate and read the Capital excerpts and have his commentary on Capital and then make an episode about it?
That stuff's down in Manchester. I could do that.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, if we really got enough Patreon money, then like we could both go to Metaforum, which is like the annual conference of sort of beer rights.
Hell yeah!
Which Shane visited last year.
I met Raul Espejo, who was for a while the director of CyberSyn, or one of the very high places. He worked very, very closely with beer, and he barely escaped with his life. From the coup, and it was only kind of after we were leaving and heading to the airport that I realized it was that Raul, and it was because I was talking to someone. We were heading to the airport, and it was like, oh yeah, like you know, we come every year, and like it's Raul doesn't really talk about the practicality so much these days. He kind of focuses on the theory because like it's just too fucking painful to like talk about implementation, because like he was a friend of Salvador Allende, and like he became a good friend of beer, and all of his fucking buddies got shot, you know. So he's just this sweet old Chilean guy who shows up at these conferences and is like really into the theory and stuff, but you just can't shift him onto the practice discussing it. He was kind of really sweet guy, but like kind of tragic.
Do you ever watch any of like Guzman's films?
No.
This guy who directed The Battle of Chile. You ever see that flick?
Okay, I should check that out.
No, that's kind of how I heard about the Chilean thing, and it's a haunting film. Like they had to smuggle the canisters out of the country through the Swiss embassy or through the Swedish embassy.
Wow.
But there's a part in the movie where one of the camera people gets shot and dies, and so you see him dying from his perspective.
Jesus Christ.
Are you serious?
Yeah, he gets killed by a fascist. No, it's a great film, but the guy's filmography after that is kind of haunted by it, and he did this movie called. But he did this movie where it takes place again in Chile like later, and it's contemporary. It came out a few years ago, and it's about these Chilean space observatories, and it gets like super metaphysical. And that's how I knew about this stuff about like the women going through like the desert, looking up like bodies and shit like that. That's like a part of it. It's all, but you see like how it's got Nostalgia for the Light. That's what it's called. It's from 2010, and it's kind of about, I don't know. It gets very cosmic in terms of like the almost fallout and entropy from like what happened, and just kind of the state of where Chilean society is at right now. But you get this sense that like Chile is like a really chill ass, like literally a chill place. Like the people all seem like really cool. And you can kind of understand, you know, like how they could maybe get to that kind of democratic socialism, and how I know like in the recent Revolutions episode, the guy points out how Marx and Engels kind of said that the Paris Commune failed because in some ways like they were too decent. And you kind of get the same sense with like the Chilean Revolution. Like if they might have been able to carry it further if they were a little nastier about it.
that was Castro's perspective.
Right.
It's like he gave Allende a gun, right?
Yeah.
And he's pleading with him to the end to fight.
You got to be non-compliant. Yeah. Here, read this book. It's by Nick Land. It's from the future. Okay. Remember, intelligence only matters when it gets mean.
I don't know. It's really hard.
Yeah, no, it is.
Even today.
I mean, if you're interested in the Chilean Revolution, you have to watch that movie because it's like they filmed it on the ground when it was happening.
Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like 6 hours long, but it's really great. And like they show strikes and street demonstrations. They talk to workers and they talk about the way they're like creating like the industrial cords and like coordinating the economy. Like, yeah, it's pretty great.
Nice.
Jake, you gotta introduce more of our audience to dope socialist films.
Yeah.
Who have we got left for closing remarks? Rosa?
I can't even like comment because television is so fucking loud in the background. Yeah, and my phone mic just picks it all up, unlike the snowball mic. But I wish I got more time to comment on like some of the stuff in relation to like computers. That part was relatively interesting. How like technology is technology is affected, like the implementation of technology is limited by power in a sense, like, you know, how like automation is only implemented to benefit the managerial class and like the capitalist class, what the overarching capitalist class, rather than like, you know, being an advancement onto itself. So computer technology is ultimately limited to just being used to manage people, and that's why they're functionally afraid of technology. It's merely a tool of their like domination. I thought that was relatively interesting. Yeah, that was a big part of it. Although I do feel he probably would have benefited from engaging with like other bodies of thought outside of cybernetics in relation to like, you know, political philosophy, Marxism. Obviously, he ends up doing that later on. But yeah, I feel like it would have been helpful for engaging it, because generally, like, some of the stuff that thoughts that he has about liberty and freedom are like counterposed to like general political philosophy in ways that are kind of unconventional, but kind of come out of the fact that he's not really engaging in that discourse per se, or at least not here. He might direct in his like more thorough writings. He probably directs it, directly engages in it more, right? I'm assuming.
He's not. Yeah, he's always got this kind of little sort of blind spot for the sociological stuff. And like I said, like I think it would be really fascinating to see a different beer that engaged with Marxism, or even just kind of engaged with political economy much earlier. I think he just came to it so late in his career that it wasn't that much of a kind of a focus. I guess that's kind of our project, right? Yeah. To kind of really do that fusion that he didn't manage to do in his own time.
Yeah, unfortunately, he spent too much time with the balls. It's not very constructive.
Yeah. Read your Marx.
Yep. Well, that's it for this episode. We hope you enjoyed the show, and hope you join us again next week for more of our usual General Intellect Unit shenanigans. If you'd like to keep up with us in the meantime, you can go to generalintellectunit.net or find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook, we're on all the podcasting apps, so like, rate, subscribe, the usual stuff. Also be sure to check out Swampside Chats and their backlog, and check out Emancipation.Network and our other sister show, From Alpha to Omega. Swampside and From Alpha to Omega, they're both excellent shows and excellent folks. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.